the man who swore he'd never have company again. The storm that changed Malcolm Everett's life arrived on a Tuesday night in October, when the Pennsylvania hills were painted amber and rust, and the first whisper of winter rode the wind through bare branches. At 63, Malcolm had perfected the art of solitude. His two-story colonial sat at the end of Maple Ridge Drive like a fortress of routine. Coffee at 6, news at 7, lights out by 10. No visitors, no phone calls, no complications. He'd sworn off companionship 3 years ago when Sarah passed, taking with her 40 years of shared morning coffee and evening news. The house still smelled faintly of her lavender soap in the upstairs bathroom, still held the indentation of her reading glasses on the kitchen counter. Malcolm had learned to live with ghosts, but he'd be damned if he'd let anything living disturb his carefully constructed silence. The power went out just after 9, plunging Maple Ridge into darkness. Malcolm fumbled for the flashlight he kept in the kitchen drawer, its weak beam dancing across familiar walls that suddenly felt foreign. Outside, the wind howled through the oak trees Sarah had planted when they first moved in, their branches scraping against the house like fingernails on glass. That's when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm like a blade through fabric. A meow, short, insistent, and somehow ancient in its knowing. Malcolm froze, flashlight beam wavering. He'd been hearing things lately. Sarah's laugh in the wind chimes, her footsteps on the stairs. His doctor called it grief, prescribed pills that made his mouth taste like cotton. But this was different. This was real. The meowing came again, closer now, followed by what sounded like claws on wood. Malcolm's heart hammered against his ribs as he approached the front door, flashlight clutched like a weapon. Through the frosted glass, he could make out a dark shape huddled on his porch. "Go away," he muttered, but his hand was already reaching for the deadbolt. The door opened with a groan of old hinges, and Malcolm's breath caught. There, sitting in a pool of rainwater like he owned the place, was a cat. Not just any cat. This one was sleek black from nose to tail, with amber eyes that reflected his flashlight beam like twin flames. The animal was soaked to the skin, shivering, but those eyes held no plea for help. Instead, they seemed to study Malcolm with an intelligence that made his skin prickle. "Shoo!" Malcolm waved his free hand. "Get out of here." The cat didn't move. If anything, it seemed to settle more firmly onto the welcome mat, as if Malcolm's words were merely suggestions it chose to ignore. "I said get." Malcolm's voice cracked like a whip, but the cat only tilted its head, considering him with those unnerving amber eyes. A gust of wind sent rain slashing across the porch, and Malcolm watched the cat's fur plaster against its thin frame. Something twisted in his chest, an unwelcome stab of recognition. He knew what it felt like to be caught in a storm with nowhere to go. "5 minutes," he said, stepping aside. "Then you're gone." The cat rose with fluid grace and padded into Malcolm's hallway, leaving a trail of wet paw prints on Sarah's hardwood floors. It paused in the living room doorway, surveying the space with the air of a landlord inspecting property, then selected a spot near the cold fireplace and began grooming its sodden fur. Malcolm stood in his own doorway, flashlight dangling at his side, watching this stranger claim his space. The cat worked methodically, pink tongue rasping against black fur, occasionally pausing to fix Malcolm with that unsettling golden stare. "What are you looking at?" Malcolm demanded, but his voice had lost its edge. The power flickered back on just as the cat finished its bath, fluorescent light spilling across the hardwood and casting long shadows up the walls. In the sudden brightness, Malcolm got his first clear look at his uninvited guest. The cat was larger than he'd first thought, probably male, with a muscular build that spoke of outdoor living. A survivor, like Malcolm himself. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. All right, show's over. Malcolm moved toward the cat, intending to shoo it toward the door, but stopped when those amber eyes fixed on him again. There was something in that gaze, a recognition that went deeper than simple animal cunning, as if the cat knew him. "I can't stay," Malcolm said, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. The cat stretched, showing impressive length, then padded to the front door. But instead of waiting to be let out, it sat down and looked back at Malcolm expectantly. Malcolm opened the door, expecting the animal to bolt into the night. Instead, the cat stepped onto the porch, turned in a small circle, and lay down directly in front of the threshold. Oh, for crying out loud. Malcolm grabbed an old towel from the hall closet and tossed it onto the porch. There, that's all you get. He closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the storm rage outside. The house felt different now, not quite so empty, not quite so cold. Malcolm shook his head, disgusted with himself. It was just a cat, a stray that would be gone by morning. But as he climbed the stairs to bed, he found himself pausing at the landing window that overlooked the front porch. The towel was there, a dark lump against the wet boards, but the cat was nowhere to be seen. Good, Malcolm told himself. Problem solved. He was almost asleep when he heard it again. That same insistent meow, but fainter now, as if coming from a great distance. Malcolm lay in the darkness, listening to the rain drum against his bedroom window, and tried to convince himself it was just the wind. But deep in his chest, something had shifted. The fortress walls he'd built around his heart had developed their first hairline crack, and through it seeped a feeling he'd thought he'd buried with Sarah, the dangerous, terrifying possibility that he might not have to face tomorrow alone. Outside, the storm began to weaken, but Malcolm Everett's real weather was just beginning. The next morning broke clear and cold, October sunshine slanting through the kitchen window as Malcolm went through his ritual: coffee, toast, morning news. He told himself he wasn't looking for the cat, but his eyes kept drifting to the front porch visible through the living room windows. Empty. The towel lay wadded in a corner, dry now and forgotten. Good, he repeated to himself, but the word tasted stale. Malcolm had just settled into his recliner with a second cup of coffee when he heard it. That same meow, pitched low and conversational, like a neighbor calling over the fence. His heart kicked against his ribs as he moved to the window. The cat sat in his driveway, grooming one paw with the unhurried confidence of someone who belonged. In daylight, Malcolm could see the animal more clearly. Sleek black fur with a white patch on his chest, amber eyes bright with intelligence, and a build that suggested he'd been living rough but wasn't starving. A survivor with dignity intact. Oh, hell no. Malcolm yanked open the front door. I told you. The cat looked up from his grooming, fixing Malcolm with that unnerving golden stare, and released a single, questioning meow. No, Malcolm said firmly. Whatever you're asking, the answer is no. But as he stood there in his doorway, arms crossed, trying to project authority, something strange happened. The cat didn't flee or cower. Instead, he seemed to nod, a barely perceptible dip of his sleek head, then padded to the edge of the porch and settled down to wait. For what? Malcolm couldn't say. The standoff lasted 20 minutes. Malcolm retreated inside, determined to ignore his uninvited guest, but found himself checking the window every few minutes like a prisoner watching the yard. The cat hadn't moved, hadn't made a sound. He simply waited with the patience of stone. By noon, Malcolm's resolve was cracking. The cat was still there, now stretched out in a patch of sunlight like he was holding court in his own private kingdom. When Malcolm stepped onto the porch to collect his mail, the cat opened one amber eye but didn't lift his head. This is ridiculous, Malcolm muttered, but he found himself speaking more to himself than the cat. You can't just set up camp on someone's property. The cat's only response was to begin purring, a low rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the porch boards and up into Malcolm's bones. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the yard and the first stars pricked the darkening sky, Malcolm found himself standing at his kitchen window with a can of tuna and a chipped ceramic bowl. Sarah's voice echoed in his memory. Malcolm Everett. That animal is half-starved. Would it kill you to show a little Christian kindness? Just this once, he told himself as he spooned tuna into the bowl. Then he'll move on. But when Malcolm opened the front door, bowl in hand, the cat was already gone. The porch sat empty in the gathering dusk, and Malcolm felt something uncomfortably close to disappointment settle in his chest. Fine, he said to no one. Your loss. He was about to turn back inside when a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, at the edge of his property where the driveway met the road, two amber eyes gleamed in the darkness like fallen stars. Malcolm set the bowl on the porch steps and retreated inside, watching through the window as a shadow detached itself from the night and glided toward his offering. The cat approached with caution, but not fear, sniffing the bowl before settling down to eat with the deliberate movements of someone who understood dignity, even in hunger. When the bowl was empty, the cat looked directly at Malcolm's window, somehow knowing exactly where he stood, and dipped his head in what could only be described as acknowledgement. Then he melted back into the darkness, leaving Malcolm standing alone in his bright kitchen with questions he couldn't answer. This pattern continued for 3 days. Each morning Malcolm would find the cat waiting, never in the same spot twice, but always visible from the house. Each evening Malcolm would set out food, telling himself it was temporary, that he was just being practical. Can't have strays dying on the property, it would lower home values. But on the 4th morning something changed. Malcolm opened his front door to retrieve the newspaper and nearly jumped out of his skin. The cat sat directly on his welcome mat, close enough to touch, those amber eyes fixed on Malcolm's face with an intensity that made his breath catch. "Jesus Christ," Malcolm breathed, heart hammering. "You scared the hell out of me." The cat's only response was to stand, stretch with fluid grace, and pad to the edge of the porch where he settled down to wait. But this time, when Malcolm returned with food, the cat didn't retreat to the shadows. Instead, he ate while Malcolm watched from the doorway, only an arm's length between them. "What do you want from me?" Malcolm asked, his voice softer than he intended. The cat paused in his eating, looked up at Malcolm with those ancient amber eyes and began to purr. The sound seemed to fill the space between them, vibrating through the evening air like a tuning fork struck against crystal. For the first time in 3 years, Malcolm Everett felt something stir in his chest that wasn't grief or anger, or the hollow ache of loss. It was fragile and frightening, like a candle flame in a strong wind, but it was unmistakably alive. That night, as Malcolm lay in bed listening to the house settle around him, he realized he'd been holding his breath for 3 years, waiting for permission to exhale. The cat, this strange, patient creature who had chosen his doorstep out of all the doorsteps in the world, had somehow given him that permission. Tomorrow, he decided, he would buy proper cat food. And maybe, he would allow himself to consider the possibility that the universe wasn't done with Malcolm Everett just yet. Outside, in the darkness that wrapped around his house like a blanket, 2 amber eyes kept watch, and the night didn't seem quite so empty anymore. The pet store clerk looked at Malcolm like he'd grown a second head when he asked for just a small bag of cat food. The kid couldn't have been more than 20, with purple hair and enough facial piercings to set off a metal detector, but his eyes were kind as they took in Malcolm's obvious discomfort. "First cat?" the clerk asked, leading Malcolm down an aisle lined floor to ceiling with colorful bags and cans. "It's not my cat," Malcolm said quickly. "Just helping out a stray." The clerk, his name tag read Devon, nodded with the kind of understanding that suggested he'd heard this story before. "Right. Well, for a not your cat, I'd recommend this." He hefted a medium-sized bag of premium dry food. "Good nutrition, won't break the bank, and if he's been living rough, his stomach will thank you for the gentle ingredients." Malcolm found himself nodding, even as part of his mind rebelled against the whole situation. How had he gone from shooing a cat off his porch to standing in PetSmart discussing digestive health with a kid young enough to be his grandson? "You'll want some wet food too," Devon continued, apparently warming to his subject. "Cats get a lot of their water from food, especially outdoor cats. Keeps their kidneys healthy." He paused, studying Malcolm with those knowing young eyes. "And maybe some treats, for building trust." Trust. The word hit Malcolm like a physical blow, dredging up memories he'd spent 3 years trying to bury. Sarah feeding the birds every morning, scattering seeds with the patience of someone who understood that wild things needed time to accept kindness. "Trust is earned 1 crumb at a time," she used to say. Malcolm left the store with more supplies than he'd intended: food, treats, a water bowl, and, inexplicably, a small stuffed mouse that Devon had sworn was irresistible to even the most dignified cats. Back home, Malcolm found his visitor waiting in the usual spot at the edge of the driveway. But something was different. The cat looked smaller somehow, subdued. As Malcolm approached with the new food bowl, he realized why. The animal was favoring his left front paw, lifting it delicately off the ground with each step. "What did you do to yourself?" Malcolm asked, forgetting his determination to remain detached. The cat limped closer, amber eyes dim with pain, but still holding that steady, trusting gaze that had become so familiar. When he reached the food bowl, he collapsed more than sat, the effort of walking clearly exhausting. Malcolm knelt beside the cat before he could think better of it, his fingers hovering inches from the injured paw. "Let me see." The cat didn't pull away. If anything, he leaned slightly toward Malcolm's touch, a barely audible whimper escaping his throat. Malcolm's fingers found matted fur around the paw pad, sticky with what looked like dried blood. "Oh, hell," Malcolm muttered. "You stepped on something, didn't you?" The nearest veterinary clinic was 20 minutes away in downtown Millbrook, a tidy brick building sandwiched between a coffee shop and a used bookstore. Malcolm had driven past it countless times in the 3 years since Sarah's death, but never had reason to stop. Now he sat in his truck in the parking lot, the injured cat in a cardboard box on the passenger seat, wondering what the hell he was doing. The cat, who had submitted to being boxed with surprising grace, was silent during the drive, but Malcolm could feel those amber eyes watching him through the cardboard air holes, judging him, maybe, or simply waiting to see what kind of man Malcolm Everett really was when push came to shove. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Dr. Rachel Martinez was about Malcolm's age, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that moved with the confident gentleness of someone who'd been healing animals for decades. She examined the cat with professional thoroughness, while Malcolm stood awkwardly in the corner, feeling like an imposter in his own story. "He's in good shape overall, Doctor," Martinez said, her fingers gentle as she cleaned the wounded paw. "Well-muscled, good weight, coat's healthy. He's been taking care of himself, but this cut is deep, probably from broken glass." She looked up at Malcolm. "He's lucky you brought him in. Another day or two and we'd be looking at serious infection." "He's not," Malcolm started, then stopped. The words, "not my cat," felt hollow in his mouth, like a lie he was tired of telling. "Doctor." Martinez's knowing smile suggested she'd heard those words before too. "Of course. Well, your not cat is going to need antibiotics and daily wound care for the next week. I can show you how to clean the paw and apply the ointment." As she demonstrated the care routine, Malcolm found himself asking questions he hadn't planned to ask. How old is he? Is he healthy otherwise? Has he been neutered? "I'd guess around 4 years old, maybe 5. "He's been neutered. Probably had an owner at some point. And there's something else." Dr. Martinez ran a small scanner over the cat's shoulder and the device beeped. "He's microchipped. The registration is old, from North Carolina, but we're legally required to try to contact the registered owner." Malcolm's stomach dropped. "What does that mean?" "We'll send out a notice. Wait 10 days for a response. If no one claims him..." She shrugged. "Well, then you'll need to decide what happens next." The drive home was silent except for the soft sounds of the cat shifting in his box. Malcolm's mind raced with unwelcome possibilities. Someone else had loved this cat once. Somewhere out there might be a family wondering what had happened to their pet, hoping against hope that he'd find his way home. But as Malcolm pulled into his driveway and saw his house waiting, really saw it, maybe for the first time in years, he realized how different it looked now. The porch he'd sat on every evening seemed less like a watchtower and more like a threshold. The windows that had felt like barriers now seemed like invitations to let light in. Back on the porch, the cat submitted to having his paw cleaned and dressed with the same quiet dignity he'd shown at the vet's office. When Malcolm finished, the cat looked up at him with those amber eyes and purred, a sound like distant thunder, like contentment given voice. "So you need a name," Malcolm said suddenly, surprised by his own words. "Can't keep calling you cat if you're going to be here for a week." The cat tilted his head, as if considering the gravity of the moment. Malcolm thought of the night they'd met, of amber eyes gleaming in the darkness like fallen stars, of the patient way this creature had waited on his porch, refusing to be driven away, but never demanding entry, of the quiet strength that had called to something buried deep in Malcolm's chest. "Knox," he said finally, "short for Knoxley, like the night you showed up." The cat, Knoxley, blinked slowly, a gesture that cat owners knew meant love and acceptance. Then he settled down on the porch with his injured paw tucked carefully beneath him, his purr rumbling through the evening air like a promise. Malcolm sat down in the chair he'd dragged out for these evening feeding sessions, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't counting the minutes until it was acceptable to go inside and shut out the world. Instead, he found himself hoping the evening would stretch on just a little longer. 10 days. That's how long he had before someone might come to take Knoxley away. So it shouldn't matter, The cat wasn't his, and he'd sworn off companions for good reason. But as Malcolm sat on his porch in the gathering dusk, listening to Noxley's contented purr and watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, he realized with a sick twist of his stomach that it mattered more than he wanted to admit. The universe, it seemed, wasn't done testing Malcolm Everett's resolve. Day 6 arrived wrapped in the kind of October morning that made Pennsylvania postcard pretty. Crisp air that carried the promise of winter, maple trees blazing scarlet and gold, and a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Malcolm had started his mornings differently now. Coffee first, then straight to the porch to check on Noxley's paw and refill his food and water bowls. The cat's injury was healing well. The angry redness had faded to pink, and Noxley was putting weight on the paw without wincing. But it was more than physical healing happening on Malcolm's front porch. Something deeper was mending too, something Malcolm hadn't realized was broken until it began to repair itself. He'd caught himself doing things that would have been unthinkable a week ago, leaving the front door open so Noxley could hear the morning news, moving his coffee mug to the porch railing so he could sit with the cat while he drank. Even, God help him, talking to Noxley like he was a person who might actually care about the weather or Malcolm's opinions on the sorry state of modern journalism. "Supposed to rain later," Malcolm said now, settling into the plastic chair he'd moved permanently to the porch. Noxley looked up from his breakfast, amber eyes alert and interested. Might want to find somewhere dry to hole up. It was a suggestion, not an invitation. Malcolm told himself this every morning, even as he found himself glancing at the front door and wondering how waterproof cardboard boxes really were. The call came at 11:47 a.m., just as Malcolm was debating whether to risk a trip to Millbrook for groceries or wait until after the storm passed. Dr. Martinez's voice was professionally neutral, but Malcolm caught the undertone of sympathy. "We heard back about Noxley's microchip," she said without preamble. "The registered owner is Mrs. Eleanor Hoffman in Asheville, North Carolina. She's 93 years old and moved into assisted living 6 months ago." Malcolm's chest tightened. "And she can't take him back. She's heartbroken about it, but the facility has a strict no-pets policy, and she doesn't have family who can help." Dr. Martinez paused. "She asked me to make sure he goes to a good home. Said he was the best companion she ever had. Never caused a moment's trouble." The relief that flooded through Malcolm was followed immediately by guilt. Some elderly woman had lost her best friend, and here he was feeling grateful that he wouldn't have to give up a cat he'd sworn he didn't want. "What happens now?" he asked. "Well, technically he's a stray in need of placement. I can put him on our adoption list, but I have to be honest, black cats don't adopt easily, and at his age," she trailed off diplomatically. "Or, if you're interested in making this arrangement permanent, I have the paperwork right here." Malcolm sat in his kitchen, phone pressed to his ear, and looked out at the porch where Noxley was stretched out in a patch of sunlight, like he owned the place. Those amber eyes seemed to sense his attention and opened, fixing Malcolm with that steady, trusting gaze that had become the most familiar sight in his world. "I'll be there in an hour," Malcolm heard himself say. The paperwork was surprisingly simple for something that felt so momentous. Adoption fees, vaccination schedules, spay-neuter certificates, already completed, emergency contact information. Malcolm's hand shook slightly as he signed his name on the final form, making it official. Noxley was his responsibility now, his family, his to protect and care for. But as he drove home through the first drops of the promised rain, Malcolm realized the weight settling on his chest wasn't responsibility. It was something far more dangerous. It was hope. The storm that had been threatening all day arrived just as Malcolm pulled into his driveway, fat raindrops spattering his windshield and sending Noxley scrambling for shelter under the porch eaves. Malcolm sat in his truck for a moment, watching the cat huddle against the house, and made a decision that would have seemed impossible 2 weeks ago. He opened the front door and stepped back. "Come on," he said quietly. "It's time." Noxley approached the threshold cautiously, amber eyes darting from Malcolm's face to the warm, dry interior beyond. He'd spent days on this porch, always looking in but never crossing the line uninvited. Now, with Malcolm's explicit permission, he stepped delicately over the threshold and into the house. The cat moved through Malcolm's living room with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. He sniffed the corners where dust had gathered, investigated the space behind Sarah's old piano, and finally settled on the braided rug in front of the cold fireplace. Then he looked up at Malcolm and began to purr, The sound filled the house in a way Malcolm hadn't expected, not just audible, but somehow physical, vibrating through the hardwood floors and up into his bones. For the first time since Sarah's death, the house felt occupied rather than just inhabited. "House rules," Malcolm said, settling into his recliner while rain drummed against the windows. "No clawing the furniture, no jumping on counters, and absolutely no sleeping on my bed." Noxley's purr deepened, and Malcolm could have sworn he saw amusement flicker in those amber eyes. That first night with Noxley inside changed everything. Malcolm woke at 3 a.m. to use the bathroom and found the cat stretched across Sarah's side of the bed, dead asleep and snoring softly. He should have moved him, should have enforced the boundaries he'd tried to establish. Instead, Malcolm found himself carefully climbing back into bed so as not to disturb his sleeping companion. The cat's presence was warm and solid against his leg, a comfort he hadn't realized he'd been missing. For the first time in 3 years, Malcolm Everett fell asleep in a house that didn't echo with emptiness. But in the morning, reality crept back in like cold air under a door. Noxley was his responsibility now, legally and morally. That meant vet bills, food costs, the constant worry that came with caring about something fragile and mortal. It meant opening himself up to loss all over again. As Malcolm watched Noxley explore his new indoor territory with the confident curiosity of someone who belonged, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that signaled panic. What had he done? What if something happened to the cat? What if he got sick or injured? Or simply decided one day that Malcolm wasn't enough and wandered off to find something better? This was a mistake, Malcolm said aloud, but his voice lacked conviction. Noxley paused in his exploration of the kitchen and looked back at Malcolm with those knowing, amber eyes. Then he padded over, rubbed once against Malcolm's legs, and settled at his feet like he'd been doing it all his life. Despite everything, the fear, the responsibility, the terrifying possibility of future heartbreak, Malcolm found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. Maybe caring about something was worth the risk of losing it. Maybe the alternative, the careful, controlled emptiness he'd been living in, wasn't living at all. Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside Malcolm's house, two souls who had found each other in the darkness were learning to build something new together. Something that looked suspiciously like home. The morning Malcolm woke up to silence, he knew something was wrong. For 3 weeks, Noxley had been his alarm clock, padding across the hardwood floors at exactly 6:15 a.m., then sitting beside the bed and releasing a single questioning meow that somehow conveyed both "good morning" and "where's breakfast" with equal clarity. But today the house was quiet. Malcolm found Noxley in the living room, stretched out in his favorite spot of morning sunlight, but something was off. The cat's breathing was shallow, and those bright amber eyes seemed dulled, unfocused. When Malcolm called his name, Noxley lifted his head but didn't rise. The emergency vet clinic in downtown Millbrook was bustling with the controlled chaos of a Saturday morning. Families with injured pets, weekend warriors whose hiking dogs had tangled with the wrong end of a porcupine, and in the middle of it all, Malcolm Everett clutching a carrier containing the most important thing in his suddenly reconfigured world. He was fine yesterday, Malcolm told Dr. Sarah Chen, a young veterinarian with gentle hands and patient eyes, ate his dinner, played with that stupid mouse toy, slept on the bed like always. This morning he could barely lift his head. Dr. Chen's examination was thorough but revealed nothing obvious. Blood work would take time, but in the meanwhile she recommended IV fluids and observation. Malcolm found himself agreeing to leave Noxley overnight, the first time they'd been separated since the cat had claimed his house and his heart. The drive home was torture. Every turn felt wrong without the soft sounds of Noxley shifting in his carrier. Every mile stretched like hours. Malcolm's house, when he finally reached it, felt cavernous and dead. He stood in his living room, staring at the empty patch of sunlight where Noxley should have been napping, and realized with crystalline clarity how much his life had changed. The silence was unbearable. Malcolm had always been a man of routine, but his routines now revolved around a four-legged companion who demanded breakfast at dawn, insisted on supervised backyard exploration every afternoon, and had claimed the right side of Malcolm's bed with the quiet authority of someone who belonged. Without Noxley, the day stretched ahead like a desert. He tried to distract himself, cleaned the kitchen, organized his modest workshop, even attempted to read the thriller novel he'd been struggling through for months, but every few minutes His eyes would drift to Noxley's food bowls, still full from the morning, or to the indentation in the sofa cushion where the cat liked to nap while Malcolm watched the evening news. By evening, Malcolm was pacing like a caged animal. He'd called the clinic twice for updates, stable but lethargic, they said, and was contemplating a third call when his phone rang. "Mr. Everett, this is Dr. Chen. I have good news about Noxley." Malcolm's knees nearly buckled with relief. "He's okay?" "He's going to be fine. His blood work showed he'd gotten into something he shouldn't have, probably a mouse or small bird that had ingested rat poison. We've flushed his system and given him medication to counteract the toxins. He should be back to himself by tomorrow." The news should have been pure relief, but instead, Malcolm felt something darker creeping in around the edges. Rat poison. His neighbor 2 houses down had mentioned putting out poison for the mice getting into his garage. If Noxley had caught one of those mice... "This is my fault," Malcolm said, sinking into his kitchen chair. "I should have kept him inside. I should have been watching more carefully." "Mr. Everett, Doctor." Chen's voice was kind but firm. "Cats are hunters. It's their nature. You can't protect them from everything without denying them the chance to be cats. What matters is that you recognized something was wrong and got him help quickly." But Malcolm's mind was already spiraling down familiar paths. This was why he'd sworn off caring about anything that could be taken away. This was why Sarah's death had nearly destroyed him, because love always came with the possibility of loss, and loss was a pain that never truly healed, just learned to hide better. That night, Malcolm lay in his too-big bed and stared at the ceiling, listening to his house settle around him in all its empty silence. Tomorrow he'd bring Noxley home, and they'd return to their comfortable routines. But now Malcolm knew how fragile it all was, how quickly everything he'd come to depend on could be snatched away. Maybe it would be better to create some distance now, before he became even more attached. Maybe he should find Noxley a good home with a younger family, people who could give him the kind of active care and constant vigilance that Malcolm, at 63 and still nursing his own wounds, might not be capable of providing. The thought made him feel sick, but the alternative, going through the kind of loss he'd experienced with Sarah, felt impossible. Malcolm was still wrestling with these thoughts when he returned to the clinic the next morning to collect Noxley. But the moment he saw his cat, alert now, amber eyes bright with recognition, pressing against the carrier door with obvious eagerness to go home, all of Malcolm's carefully constructed arguments crumbled. "There's my boy," Malcolm murmured, and Noxley responded with a purr that seemed to vibrate through the entire carrier. Dr. Chen handed over discharge instructions and a bottle of medication, but Malcolm barely heard her words. He was too busy watching Noxley, cataloguing every sign that his cat was truly okay, truly coming home. "He'll be fine," Dr. Chen assured him as she walked them to the parking lot. "But I can see you're still worried. Would you like some advice?" Malcolm nodded, not trusting his voice. "Love isn't about protecting someone from every possible harm," she said gently. "It's about giving them the best life you can while you have them, and trusting that the joy you create together is worth the risk of heartbreak." The drive home was filled with Noxley's conversational meows, a running commentary that sounded like complaints about the vet, observations about the passing scenery, and expressions of satisfaction at being reunited with his person. Malcolm found himself talking back, a ridiculous conversation between man and cat that felt like the most natural thing in the world. Back home, Noxley made a circuit of the house as if reassuring himself that everything was as he'd left it, then settled into his spot of morning sunlight with a satisfied sigh. Malcolm watched him from the kitchen doorway and realized that Dr. Chen had been right. The fear of losing Noxley would always be there, lurking at the edges of every ordinary moment. But the alternative, a life without the warmth of purring on cold mornings, without amber eyes that seemed to see straight into his soul, without the simple daily miracle of being needed and wanted by another living creature, that wasn't living at all. That evening, as Malcolm sat on his porch with Noxley curled in his lap, he thought about Sarah and the 40 years they'd had together. Yes, losing her had nearly destroyed him. But would he trade those 40 years to avoid the pain of her loss? Not for all the safety in the world. "You scared me, you know that," Malcolm said quietly, his fingers working through Noxley's soft fur. The cat purred and pressed his head against Malcolm's palm, a gesture that seemed to say he understood, and he was sorry, and he was here now. Pennsylvania hills and painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Malcolm Everett made a decision that would have seemed impossible just a month ago. He was going to stop living like a man afraid of his own shadow. He was going to stop measuring every moment against the possibility of loss and start measuring it against the certainty of love. "We're in this together now," he told Noxley, who responded by purring louder and settling more firmly into Malcolm's lap. "Whatever comes." Inside the house, the phone rang, probably a telemarketer, or maybe his sister calling from Arizona with her weekly check-in. Malcolm made no move to answer it. For the first time in 3 years, he had something more important than staying busy or avoiding connection. He had a cat who trusted him completely, a responsibility that made him feel useful again, and the radical realization that caring about something fragile and mortal wasn't a weakness. It was the bravest thing a person could do. The stars were just beginning to appear in the darkening sky when Malcolm finally carried Noxley inside. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new small victories, new moments of ordinary joy that added up to something that looked suspiciously like happiness. And yes, it would also bring the constant, quiet awareness that this too could be taken away. But tonight, in a house that no longer echoed with emptiness, Malcolm Everett fell asleep to the sound of purring and the warmth of a small life pressed against his side. Outside, the world spun on with all its uncertainties and sorrows, but inside, two souls who had found each other in the darkness were learning that home wasn't a place. It was the sound of someone else breathing beside you in the night, the knowledge that you mattered to another living creature, and the daily choice to love something despite the risk of losing it. It was the sound of life happening, one purr at a time. The sign on Malcolm's front gate read Noxley's Place in simple black letters, but everyone in the neighborhood knew it really meant something much larger than just a house number. It meant second chances. It meant the kind of home where broken things, whether they walked on 4 legs or 2, could come to heal. Malcolm hadn't planned to become the unofficial cat sanctuary of Maple Ridge Drive. It started with Mrs. Henderson from down the street, who knocked on his door one February morning with a cardboard box and desperation in her eyes. Inside was a scrawny orange tabby with one eye and an attitude that suggested he'd seen the worst the world had to offer. "I know you took in that black cat," she'd said, shifting from foot to foot on his porch, "and Charlie here needs someone who understands that trust doesn't come easy." That was the beginning. Word spread through the quiet network of people who noticed strays. The mail carrier, the newspaper boy, the woman who managed the coffee shop in town where Malcolm had started stopping every Saturday morning. Not because he needed coffee, but because Noxley seemed to enjoy the car rides, sitting in his carrier and commenting on everything they passed with soft meows that sounded like observations about the state of the world. Now 6 months after nearly losing Noxley to rat poison, Malcolm's house was home to 5 cats. Noxley, the dignified patriarch who still claimed the right side of Malcolm's bed. Charlie, the one-eyed orange tabby who had appointed himself head of security. Luna, a tiny grey female who had been found half frozen behind the grocery store. Jasper, a massive Maine Coon mix with a gentle soul and a purr like a diesel engine. And most recently, Pip, a black and white kitten who had been abandoned at the vet clinic and somehow convinced Dr. Chen that Malcolm Everett was exactly the kind of person who needed a kitten in his life. The house had transformed along with Malcolm. Where once silence had reigned, now there was the constant soundtrack of life. The patter of paws on hardwood, the whispered conversations between cats arranging themselves in sunbeams, the rustle of someone, always someone, rearranging the blankets on the sofa. Malcolm's furniture bore the gentle scars of claw marks and cat hair. His windowsills were lined with beds and scratching posts, and his grocery bill had tripled. He had never been happier. "You know what your problem is?" his sister Janet had said during her last visit from Arizona, watching Malcolm portion out 5 different types of food while his cats arranged themselves around his feet like a feline honor guard. "You've gone soft." Malcolm had considered this accusation while Noxley wound around his ankles and Pip attempted to climb his leg like a tree. Soft? Yes, probably. The careful armor he'd built around his heart after Sarah's death had been completely dismantled by amber eyes and patient purring. But soft, he'd discovered, wasn't the same thing as weak. Soft meant available for love. Soft meant brave enough to care despite the risk. "Guilty as charged," he'd told Janet, and scratched Noxley behind the ears while the cat purred his approval. The routine that had once centered around avoiding connection now revolved around nurturing it. Mornings began with the great breakfast assembly. 5 bowls, 5 different dietary needs, and the careful diplomacy required to keep Charlie from eating everyone else's food while ensuring Luna got enough, despite her bird-like appetite. Afternoons were for supervised backyard adventures, with Malcolm sitting on his porch like a shepherd, watching his flock explore the safety of his fenced yard. Evenings were for settling into his recliner, with whoever had claimed his lap that day, usually Noxley but sometimes Pip, who seemed to believe that humans existed primarily as cat furniture. The vet bills were substantial, the responsibility was constant, the potential for heartbreak had multiplied by 5. But so had the potential for joy, and Malcolm had learned that the mathematics of love didn't work the way he'd thought. 5 cats didn't mean 5 times the worry. They meant 5 times the small daily miracles that reminded him what it felt like to be fully alive. Dr. Chen had become a friend as well as a veterinarian, stopping by sometimes just to check on her rescues and to marvel at the transformation in both Malcolm and his house. "You know," she'd said just last week, "I used to worry about older people who lived alone. Now I think maybe what they really need isn't less responsibility. It's the right kind of responsibility." Malcolm understood what she meant. Caring for his cats had given him something that 3 years of careful isolation never had: a reason to get up every morning, a purpose that went beyond simply enduring until bedtime. They needed him, but more than that, they trusted him. And trust, Malcolm had learned, was the most precious gift one living creature could give another. Tonight, as spring rain drummed against the windows and 5 cats arranged themselves around the living room in their preferred sleeping spots, Malcolm sat in his chair and marveled at the path that had brought him here. It had started with a simple refusal to turn away from a pair of amber eyes in the darkness. It had continued with the radical decision to let his heart crack open, despite every instinct telling him to stay safe behind his walls. Noxley, now fully grown into his role as the house patriarch, padded over and settled across Malcolm's lap, with the confidence of someone who knew he was exactly where he belonged. His purr rumbled through the quiet house like a lullaby, and Malcolm found himself thinking about Sarah and what she might say if she could see him now. She would laugh, probably. Sarah had always accused Malcolm of being a softer touch than he wanted to admit, had always said he had too much love in him to keep it locked away forever. She would say she wasn't surprised that it took a cat, no 5 cats, to crack him open again. But mostly Malcolm thought she would be proud that he'd found his way back to the land of the living, proud that he'd learned the difference between existing and actually being alive, proud that he'd discovered what she'd always known, that love multiplied when it was shared, and that the risk of heartbreak was always worth the certainty of connection. As Noxley's purr vibrated through his chest and the rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, Malcolm Everett closed his eyes and listened to the sound of home. It wasn't the silence he'd cultivated for 3 years after Sarah's death. It was better than silence. It was the soft breathing of creatures who trusted him, the whisper of paws on hardwood, the rustle of someone rearranging themselves for maximum comfort. It was the sound of love happening, one purr at a time, in a house that had learned to live again. Outside, the storm continued its spring symphony, but inside Noxley's place, a name that had started as a joke but had become the truest thing Malcolm knew, warmth and contentment reigned supreme. And in his chair at the center of it all, a man who had sworn he would never have company again, discovered that sometimes the best promises are the ones we're brave enough to break. The universe, it seemed, had known exactly what Malcolm Everett needed all along. It just took a patient black cat with amber eyes to show him the way home.